Okay, cool. Well, hi everyone. Really excited to be here today. So as you just heard, I'm James Nash. By day, I work in a design system team in JP Morgan, and by night, I put on a dark cape and I work for the Design Tokens community group, which I'll be telling you more about in a little moment. So without further ado, let's dive into the future of design tokens. Ooh. I'm just going to pick it working. Sorry. There we go. Right. So if you spent any time at all around design system, Twitter, or the various Slack forums, you've probably seen this meme at some point. And it's kind of an evergreen meme, right? So design tokens have been so hot right now for some time, and they still are. I was looking at the agenda for this conference, and about a quarter of the talks have design tokens in their title, and even some of the ones that don't mention them or reference them in some way. So it's clearly a hot topic, and I think rightly so. But what exactly do we mean by design tokens? Now, I'm probably preaching to the converted here. I'm sure a lot of you know already, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. Design tokens are often described as kind of named design attributes. So when you assign a name to things like a color or amount of spacing, that's a design token. And as with anything in design systems, there's a number of definitions out there. This is one by the Design Tokens community group, which I obviously quite like. I'm biased. But I like it because it calls out a few key characteristics. So a design token is a single source of truth for a named design decision. And I quite like this term because if you think about it, you know, the colors, spacings, the border radiuses, font styles, and so on, those are design decisions. And the act of assigning a name for them and making them reusable is well, it's an expression of that decision. And now the other point that I think is often overlooked is that design tokens are really meant to be tool and programming language agnostic. So they're kind of the single source of truth from which you might generate various representations for different programming languages or tools or whatever. Now, before we get to the future of design tokens, I think it's worth taking a little quick ride through the past, where they've come from, and particularly the tools that have grown up around them, because I think that starts to paint a bit of a trajectory of where things might be headed next. So you may be surprised to know that design tokens are actually quite old. It was 2013 when Gina Ann, who pioneered the concept and came up with the name, well, at the time she was working on the website for SAS, which is an open source project. And she wanted to create a style guide page and also have the corresponding code for the various styles and have the two things be in sync with one another. And the solution she came up with was to express those design values once, and she used a text format called YAML to do that. And she wrote a program in Ruby which would read that file and then auto-generate SAS code which could be used in the styling and HTML to present a style guide page. Now, if you think about it, there's a few more pieces to this puzzle. So that file wasn't just sitting in a vacuum, it was stored and versioned in a Git repository, so there was some place to store it. And she would have used some sort of text editor to actually create and edit that file in the first place. So we've got this kind of chain of different tools. Now, it was a few months later, and by now it's 2014, and Gina was also working at Salesforce. And there was a project she was involved in where they were creating a mobile app, and they had native Android and native iOS versions. And they had this challenge of wanting to use the same colors and styles across each, but the way those are written in the code for the different platforms is different. And so, borrowing from the idea that she sort of pioneered on the SAS website, the team produced a tool called Theo, which they also open sourced. And it kind of does a similar thing. So it too takes the raw design tokens in a YAML-based format, although a slightly different structure to what Gina had done for SAS. And then from that, it generates code for iOS, code for Android, code for web. You can make HTML style guide pages and all sorts of other things. And so Theo is kind of like the OG design token tool. Now, a couple of years later, there was a company called BrandAI, and they had an interesting product. It did more than just design tokens, but this is just a view of the design token functionality that it had. And it was a single tool, sort of an online tool, but it combined those three roles in one thing. So it could store tokens, it could export them as various programming languages, and it could display documentation pages, which would list out, for example, your color swatches and things like that. But now the source of where those tokens came from was a design tool, specifically Sketch. So they had a plugin which would, within Sketch, you could sort of extract your colors and document them in the plugin, and then those would get synchronized up to BrandAI. So it was no longer editing code in a text editor, it was using a design tool. BrandAI had, interestingly, also had the ability to generate Microsoft Office templates using your color palette, which I thought was kind of a cool idea. And also, it had a means of getting hold of the raw tokens. This time it was using a JSON-based format, again, with its own sort of structure. And this was an interesting sort of hook for people to build other things on. So the team I was working in around this time, I think it was actually 2017 when we did this, we were working on a project using BrandAI, and we thought it'd be kind of neat to analyze all our colors and figure out which ones create accessible contrast ratio. So kind of similar to what Lucas was talking about in the last talk. So we use this tool called Contrast Grid by 8Shapes, which is an online tool. You just give it a bunch of colors and it'll produce a table like that, mapping every color with every other color and working out the contrast ratios and telling you which of those pass WCAG AA or AAA standard and which ones don't. So at a glance, you can see which combinations you can use. This was kind of cool. So the way we did that is we took those raw tokens, we wrote a little script that could understand that format and shoved them into the contrast grid tool. Now, BrandAI was acquired by InVision the following year, and it was shut down, but it was kind of reborn as InVision DSM. So the first version of DSM, unsurprisingly, had more or less the same feature set as BrandAI. So the next kind of noteworthy tool or evolution, I suppose, in tooling is ZeroHeight. So their tool, similar to BrandAI DSM, also stored tokens and exported them and documented them. But the way in which the tokens came in, they were slightly different. So it was still coming from Sketch, but rather than using a plugin in Sketch to do stuff, you would, I mean, it was using a plugin, but essentially you would upload the Sketch library file to ZeroHeight, and then something on ZeroHeight knew how to sort of extract tokens from that and save them into the store from where they could go everywhere else. And it too had a way of exporting tokens in its own format. So if you wanted to, you could write custom scripts to connect that to, for example, the contrast checking tool. Now, a couple of years later, ZeroHeight did an update to their token functionality. And it was an interesting change because they now sort of no longer did the exporting to different programming languages themselves, but instead they lent on Style Dictionary, which is, I guess, an alternative to Theo. So it's a very similar tool. It lets, you pass in design tokens and it will generate code in various languages. And its sort of source format is, well, originally it was JSON, now it supports other formats as well, but they have to be structured a particular way. So ZeroHeight can now export the tokens that you've put into ZeroHeight in that format, and you can feed them directly into Style Dictionary. And again, if you wanted to, you could take that format and build other things on top of it. ZeroHeight also added support for Figma and I think Adobe XD as well. I think DSM has since sort of added more or less the same functionality too. So last year, we saw the introduction of Specify. And with respect to design tokens, Specify is kind of similar, but again, a slightly different take on this sort of setup. So it too will import tokens from a Figma library, store them, and can export them in various formats. But it doesn't provide the sort of documentation pages out of the box. But it has an API where you can grab those tokens, and so you could build documentation things on top of that, or indeed, contrast checking or other stuff as well. Another tool that launched the same year is Supernova, which kind of does all of that stuff, but also has the documentation capability within it. And it too has an API which you could use to connect other things if you wanted to. And then one more sort of take on design tooling setups that I think is noteworthy is Figma tokens, which I know in this community obviously is a hot topic. And this is, as you probably know, it's a Figma plugin that can kind of synchronize tokens with the equivalents in Figma, like color stars and so on. It too can save that out as its own JSON format and store that in a Git repository. But what's interesting is it's a two-way sync. So now it's not just coming out of design tools and going elsewhere, but it can go back the other way. And that means if you want to, you could edit those files using a text editor. And so now developers and designers can both be manipulating the tokens and kind of synchronize with each other. They also provide a tool called Token Transform, which can convert from their format to the one the Style Dictionary understands. So then you can wire up Style Dictionary to generate code. And of course, you know, it's a JSON format. You could build your own things on top if you wanted to. So that's us caught up with the present day, more or less. Of course, there are many other tools as well, but I just wanted to sort of highlight some that introduced, I guess, different approaches to how the activities you do on tokens. So we've got all these different categories that we've seen, things that let you design tokens, import them, document them, export them, and so on. And as we've seen, different tools will do one or more of these things, which is great. So we have a lot of diversity and everyone can kind of pick whatever combination works for their needs. But as you've also seen, they all talk different languages. Some have APIs, some have different formats of JSON or YAML. And even though it's not necessarily super complicated, it's a chore to kind of convert from one to the other. So when you do want to connect one tool with another, because maybe that's what you want for your design system, there's a bit of extra work to do. And then also because of that, if you were to ever swap out one of these tools for something else, you again need to sort of rework your integrations. So where are things heading in the future? Well, what if instead of all these kinds of tools speaking different languages, they spoke the same language? Then it would become a lot easier to integrate them, right? We wouldn't have to write little scripts that can convert from one to another or speak to this API and that API. It would just become plug and play. And that would mean we could connect more tools, we could do some more easily, we could migrate between different tools. And that is precisely the goal, or one of the goals, of the Design Tokens W3C community group. So we are working on a standard for a file format for design tokens. It's currently a draft specification, but hopefully later this year we'll kind of reach our official version 1, and that will be the point at which it's considered stable enough for people to sort of start using in anger. Although I'm pleased to announce that some people have already started adding support for the draft format. So I think Lucas Opperman's Design Tokens Figma plugin, if I recall correctly, has support for this. I know Interplay have got support for it. There may be others. A few other companies have already sort of publicly pledged support for it in the future. So for example, Sketch, when they announced their color variables a few months ago, said that they intend to support this format. So I think this is a very likely near-term future that we'll see lots of tools, or existing tools, adding support for this format and thereby becoming more interoperable with each other, which would be awesome. But what else might we see when this starts to happen? Well, we might see more tools that are not currently thought of as typical design system tools kind of come into the fold. So let's take the import category, right? You've seen import tools that know how to extract tokens from things like Figma libraries and Sketch libraries, but that's not the only place you might get your tokens from. This is a tool called Superposition, which is by Kilian Valkov, and it's sort of a browser, I guess you could say. So you give it a web address, you point it at a website or a web app, and it will extract all the colors, the styles, and so on, and present them to you, as you can see here. And it can already export those into different code formats and design libraries. What if a tool like this added support for the tokens files? Then that could be really helpful if, for instance, you're setting up a design system in a situation where there are existing products that you're kind of reverse engineering your design system from, right? You could easily automatically extract the tokens that they're using today and then feed them into your system and use that as a starting point. I think analyzers is an interesting area as well. So I use the example of the color contrast checking tool, but that's just one of the types of analysis we might do on our design tokens. What you see here is, this is a screenshot of VS Code. It's a code editor, but what I'm really trying to highlight is something called linters. So linters are tools that would be familiar to developers. They basically check source code against certain rules, and they're typically used for checking against stylistic rules. So, you know, maybe a team has decided to use tabs versus spaces, or they put their curly brackets on new lines, or whatever it is. And in order to make everyone's code consistent, they use linters to check that people have followed the rules and highlight cases where they haven't. The other sort of use for linters tends to be finding typical anti-patterns. So there might be certain things that people do in code which can be problematic, and linters can kind of highlight those. And they do that in one of two ways. So as you can see in the upper half there, it can be as the developer is writing code, a bit like a word processor, they kind of get the squiggly lines to indicate that something's not right. And if you hover over, you get more detail about what the problem is. The other way, which you can see in the bottom half there, is you run this as a kind of automated test, and that's often done when code is checked in. The linters will run and highlight any deviations from the standards. So what if we could lint our token files, right? We know that different design system teams have different naming conventions, or maybe they have other rules that they want to follow. They could create linting rules and make sure that mistakes don't accidentally creep in. This is a tool called Project Wallace, which is a CSS analyzer. And you basically give it CSS code, and it will produce all these interesting stats and charts around what kinds of units you're using, specificity of your selectors, and things like that. What if we had an equivalent of this for design tokens, right? What if we could analyze our tokens and see at a glance how many colors that we have versus how many spacing units, how many, I don't know, levels of aliasing we've got. I mean, again, to Lucas's point about keeping the structures kind of flat, if that's something you're aiming for, you can imagine a tool like this could highlight cases where you've maybe got too many levels and you want to take a closer look. Oh, sorry, wrong direction. This is a tool by Michael Mangieladi, who's actually speaking after the break, after this talk. It's an open source thing he's made called Tempura. And I think this is a really interesting idea. So what this does is you give it the tokens from your design system and you point it at applications, and it will, similar to Project Wallace that we just saw, kind of extract the styles being used by those applications and compare them against the reference from your design system. And then we'll produce a report telling you where there are deviations. You know, maybe the product's got some colors that are not in your design system, or it's using amounts of spacing or something that are not quite right because they're a little bit more, a bit less than the ones from the design system. And this could be used in one of two ways, right? It could be as a sort of quality check to make sure that unintentional sort of design deviations don't creep into products, but it could also be a way of tracking the adoption of your design system. So as products use more and more of your design system, you would expect the sort of more and more parity with your design tokens. And this kind of tool could highlight that. This next one is something that Jan Six, who is one of the developers of the Figma tokens plugin, shared on Twitter a few months back. And this was, I believe, an experiment he was doing, but I think it looks absolutely awesome. So this is a way of visualizing the alias relationships between tokens. So the entries in those boxes are tokens. The ones to the right are referencing ones to the left. And as you can see, the lines are visualizing those references, but you can interactively drag and drop them to rewire your tokens. And I think that'd be an amazing way, not just to sort of see the relationships in your tokens, but to actually set them up or to manipulate them. So what if something like this could just load up your tokens from your design system, let you play around, save the result back out, and then you can just drop it into whatever other tools you're using. And that's just the analysis category, right? So I think for all of the boxes that you see there, we'll see more and more new tools, or perhaps tools that are already out there, but not sort of overtly design token or design system tools kind of get connected. And I think there'll be new categories as well. So I'm going to call these token generators. So by that, I mean tools that are just there to create or maybe manipulate certain categories of tokens. So we've got so many of these online color tools, right? This is Adobe Color, which lets you create the color palettes that look pleasing to the eye. What if a tool like this could save out the tokens, so you could, if you were setting up, I don't know, a new theme or something for your design system, you could use this as a starting point. We've got things like Color Box, which can then let you create your scales with your tints and shades, or interpolate between different colors in various ways. There's Adobe Leonardo, which is lets you create contrast-based palettes. So you give it colors and design contrast ratios, and it works out essentially the kind of the tints and shades of those colors that you need to use. And I was really impressed yesterday by the pitch from David M. And a lot of the tools he showed, I think, could easily fall into this category. By the way, I really love the name Feta Palette. I think that's a good one. That's just colors. There's all sorts of gradient generators out there. This is one by Josh W. Kumo. And rather than, so what this does, it interpolates colors in, not in the RGB color space, but in other color spaces that gives you sort of more vivid and pleasing results. And then it saves out a representation of that works in things like CSS. Again, what if this could read in your color tokens, let you create some gradients, save those out as gradient tokens for you to then use in your system? Be awesome, right? There's tools for creating drop shadows. There's tools for finding font pairings. This one here uses machine learning, apparently, to find a font that will nicely complement another font that you've chosen. So for all the kind of types of tokens, I think there's all these lovely little utilities, and it'd be great if we could connect them into our design systems. Another category I think we might see emerge is token preprocessors. So way back in the origin story, right, you may recall Gina was working on the SAS website. SAS is a CSS preprocessor. What that means is it lets developers write CSS with some essentially extra features that make it more convenient for them. They can structure the code in a more maintainable way. They can express some things more succinctly, and then SAS will read that and output the corresponding normal CSS that web browsers can understand. I can imagine the same sort of thing happening for tokens files, right? So as lovely as the format, of course, will be, there may be features or extra abilities that it doesn't have, but that someone hand authoring token files might want to have. And so you can imagine people creating what SAS is to CSS for tokens files. And that would let people write tokens in some other language and then generate the corresponding token files. One example where this could be useful would be something like a modular scale. So modular scales are commonly used to generate typography scales or spacing scales. And it's a very simple formula that you choose a base size and a multiplier, and each size is the previous one, starting with the base one, multiplied by that same number. So you get this kind of exponential progression. Now today, if design systems have used this to create, for example, their size scale, you'd probably find tokens like this, right? They will save out the calculated values and capture those as design tokens. But remember how we said that a design token is the expression of a design decision. Was the decision here actually that, I don't know, size 100 is 0.823 of a rem? Or was the decision actually to use a base size and a ratio and then let a modular scale formula just work out however many sizes you need? So a preprocessor might let you sort of express the intent in a purer way, as it were, but then still be able to generate something that's convenient for other tools to consume. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a different language. I mean, this could be normal tokens files where you write your sort of minimal set of source tokens, run it through a preprocessor that has been configured to auto-generate some additional tokens, and then that gets output as a new tokens file. So if we have all these kinds of tools and they're all lovely and interoperable and interlinked, and I'm assuming some automation here as well, of course, what does that mean for source of truth, right? We like to have these debates about, is it code, is it design? Maybe it's everything, right? At least as far as tokens are concerned. If you can get to your design tokens from your design system in your editor and make changes and save them to a repository, and then a designer can see those in their tool and add them or change them, and then someone else can hop into a color tool and fiddle about with the contrast ratios or whatever. If everything's in sync, then everything's kind of the source of truth, right? So that could be interesting. Now, all of the stuff we've looked at so far is kind of contained within a design system. So these are the tools you might find inside the design system that the maintainers are using. And design systems don't just exist in a vacuum, they exist in organizations. And a lot of the time, there's this relationship between the brand of that organization and the design system. And the brand often is owned by a different part of the organization, like the marketing team or something like that. And they will have, these typical brand PDF files or some sort of static document usually, which will say, these are our corporate colors, our corporate typeface, this is what the logo looks like, how much white space you need to have around the logo and things like that. But as we know, a lot of the time, at least for digital UIs, they don't go far enough. They don't provide enough detail and enough guidance for creating consistent, usable, accessible experiences that they're built to sort of implement that brand. And I think that's the gap that a lot of design systems have sort of come about to fill. I thought Patricia's comments on yesterday's multi-dimensional DS talk were interesting, because she was saying how, particularly with smaller startups, sometimes these are actually one and the same thing. And I think that could well be where it's headed, even for the larger organizations, because if you think about it, the information that comes from the brand that gets consumed by the design system, those are tokens. So why not have whatever tools the brand teams use export tokens in the format that the design system can directly consume? And if design systems are doing work to fine tune and tweak and augment those tokens and apply more semantics and meanings to them, they might be doing that for their own purposes for digital UIs, but a lot of that could well be applicable to other types of media as well. So what if that information could flow back the other way, and we could get more collaboration between these teams, or maybe in some cases they would even merge? That could be interesting. So all of that exists within an organization. Now, it's already the case that many organizations have open source design systems, so their code is publicly accessible. If their tokens are part of that code and they're in a standard format, that means as more and more organizations do this, we'll have all sorts of design systems tokens in a standard format in the public domain. What might that mean? Well, a parallel would be the web, right? Every web page is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript ultimately. Those are all standardized. And because of that, people can write tools that can go and crawl any website and extract information from them. Search engines would be one example. So maybe Google will let us search design tokens one day. But people also use that to do interesting analysis. So this is the Web Almanac. They produce a report once a year where they look at millions of websites, and they produce stats around, for example, the average page weight and how that compares year on year, or the different types of technology being used and what's gaining popularity, what's sort of declining. And that's really helpful for teams who are perhaps deciding what tech stack to use for the next few years, or indeed the people making the standards or the browsers that use these things, because it gives them an idea of where they need to focus their efforts or what they might need to optimize. So what if we had something like this for design tokens? What if we could see, you know, in general, how many tokens design systems tend to have, or what types of tokens they have, or how many levels of aliasing they have. That could all be really useful information. And selfishly, that could also be really helpful for those of us working on the standard format as well. I think people might start to share tokens or even just produce sets of tokens for others to use. So this is a project called OpenProps, which sort of is that already, although it's in the form of CSS custom properties. So they've got basically CSS variables, a nicely designed set that are there, and you can just pick them up and use them to build designs or components or whatever you want to do. What if they and others started to expose these in the token format that you could then just drop into your system and play with or integrate with whatever else you're doing? That could be useful. Now, zooming back into kind of a design system, I've talked a lot about the different types of tools and the different, the way the tokens flow between them. I've not really spoken a lot about that right-hand side, about the exporting. So yes, today, most of the ways in which tokens are exported tends to be source code. But remember how BrandAI, way back in 2016, could generate templates for presentations and Word documents and things? Why not? Why do we not have more of that, right? Because think about it, most organizations will use these types of tools. They will have corporate templates. Those templates will in some way reflect the brand, might be the colors, the fonts, or both. So why not have those things connected back to the design systems via tokens and all be in sync, so that if those things change, everything is kind of up to date and in sync? That could be really nice. What might that look like? So I'm using a presentation template here, right? I've got a couple of colors. I'm using that kind of green turquoise for the link in the bottom right. I have sort of a pinkish color for the gradient background. So maybe these could be tokens, right? Maybe, for argument's sake, these are my primary and secondary brand colors. If they were tokens and my presentation was connected to the tokens, I should be able to change those things. So why don't we give that a go? Perhaps someone in the audience, and I'm just gonna have to, actually, if maybe one of the organizers could just shout out suggestions. Someone please give me a new color to use instead of the green. Just say, I don't know, red, yellow, blue, whatever you want. Don't be shy. Let me see if I can turn the chat on. Oh, we've got some hex codes here. I'm not sure if I can actually paste in a hex code. Can someone describe the color?
We can describe a color.
Oh, wow, here we go. Gosh, hyperberry, that sounds cool. I'm not sure what a hyperberry is. I'm going to imagine it's purple, yeah, like a sort of blueberry type thing. So why don't we do that? And oh, would you look at that? The link changed. What about the pink? Let's have something else for the pink. Maybe something that's going to contrast with that hyperberry. Lime, yeah, let's try lime. Kind of acidy green like that. Let's go with those. So if my presentation is tokenized, and so therefore it's in sync. That's kind of cool, right? Now, if I can do that for presentations, if let's imagine I'm an organization, I've probably got like a logo and maybe, I don't know, social media profile pictures and things like that I'm using. Those two could be linked back to my tokens, right? So they could be in sync as well. And if I have social media profiles, maybe those can also be connected. And yeah, I am seeing the comments about them not being accessible. Sorry, I should have put a check in there. But you get the idea, right? All of these things can be connected. Now, you might at this point be saying, okay, that's a neat party trick, but you know, companies don't change their brand colors every 5 seconds. And that is true, but companies do sometimes have seasonal special things, right? Maybe it's Gay Pride Week and they do everything in rainbow colors for a few days, or I don't know, it's some sort of Halloween promotion and everything's purple and orange. Or maybe they've signed a big deal with another company, or there's a merger or partnership and they want to sort of play with the other company's brand colors. So there's all sorts of reasons why you might at least temporarily want to sort of deploy different colors or fonts or whatever it is across your estate. And I think design tokens could enable that in a really, in a much quicker, cheaper, holistic way than what is currently possible, where it's presumably manual. The other potential application would be sort of gradual incremental changes. So we're used to a world where particularly big companies will kind of have a brand, it's static for many years, and then there's a big rebrand and everything's changed and we've spent millions of pounds. But does it have to be that way, right? If it's really easy to sort of roll out little changes, maybe, you know, perhaps like T-Mobile, if they found that their magenta doesn't really lend itself to creating accessible color contrast ratios. But if they made it just a little bit darker or a little bit brighter, then maybe it could. But if they could just do that, right? And then from one day to the next, most people maybe wouldn't notice, but some people would be better off. And you could imagine, you know, gradually lots of little changes will add up. And, you know, if you took a snapshot today and 5 years from now, the brand would look really different, but no one really noticed the big bang change. It was just lots of little incremental things. That kind of thing could become possible. Now, this is all 2D flat UIs, right? Boxes and things on screens. We hear a lot of talk about the metaverse and mixed reality and all this stuff. Well, 3D worlds have got colors, so maybe we want to apply our tokens there as well. And in fact, we might even need additional types of tokens that we don't really use today. So if you watch that sphere in the middle, right now it's very metallic, very reflective, but you can change those things, right? So we might want to make it not quite fully matte, but a bit more matte, maybe a bit less metallic, something like that perhaps. These are just values, right? And if we're building a 3D world or a 3D user interface, we might want to reuse those values. So let's tokenize them, right? Let's keep them in sync. Perhaps the, I don't know, the disabled version of our 3D UI is matte instead of glossy or something like that. Who knows? But I think tokens will be part of it. Why stop at the virtual world? We could potentially apply our tokens in the real world. I mean, LED lighting would be the obvious thing, but you can imagine other applications in the physical world. Perhaps, I don't know, perhaps you integrate with something like moo.com, and as your brand tokens change, you automatically reorder business cards for everyone in the new colors or the new font or whatever it is. There's all sorts of things we could do. And at this point, I have a little surprise set up for you. So I'd like to switch to a little live web stream from Times Square in New York. And I'd like you to pay attention to the screens over on the right there. There we go, it's about to kick off. Yay. So we can have our tokens even appear in tourist landmarks. I was going to say tourist traps, but yeah. So in summary, what do I think is the future of design tokens? Well, I think the standard will create interoperability. That will mean more tools, more interconnections. That will enable our tokens to spread further into places that we haven't really used them so far, and also to keep things in sync. And yeah, our tokens will just go further and further and touch more and more of the world. Now, I have a little confession to make at this point. Obviously, I don't have a real time machine. I haven't traveled to the future and had a look and reported back to you. These are educated guesses, really, of what I think could happen. Maybe, if I'm honest, it's a bit of a wish list. But hopefully, by sharing these ideas today, I may have influenced the future and perhaps sparked an idea or inspired some of you to do something fun. So I really can't wait to see what you will do with tokens and where you take them in the future. And I will leave you with one final prediction, and this is one that I am pretty confident about, that years from now, we're still going to be sharing this meme. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening. And I think we have a bit of time for questions.
Yeah, James, thank you so much. It was a really great talk, really great overview. And I liked how you explained how it all changed over time and even gave like in the end this kind of like this look into the future, what can happen with like 3D and tokens. Like that's something I have not thought about at all yet. And maybe some people from the audience also didn't. Like truly great stuff. Thank you for that.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much for listening and for having me here as well.
They also had some people texting me on the side, like how can they get these tools? I think there's also some people asking that question.
As in the tools that I mentioned at the start, or
yes.
Maybe I can share some URLs on the Miro board later. But I think most of them are, well, some of them obviously are sponsors of this talk. So I'm sure the folks from Supernova and Specify and friends will happily talk about those. But the others, most of them, if you Google Style Dictionary Theo, they're pretty easy to find. But I'll share the URLs.
Thank you. And yeah, we can do some questions now. There were some in the Miro board. I'm just gonna read the first one. What are the best practices and simple rules for naming conventions?
Ooh, classic. You know, even though tokens have been around for a few years, I'm not sure there is such a thing as a best practice yet. There are probably a few conventions that have emerged. The blog title escapes me right now, but I know people have written about this. I think Nathan Curtis has got a really good blog post that springs to mind where he basically looked at the naming structures that different design systems use and sort of wrote up the patterns. So that's probably a good starting point. I can see Stuart Robson has shared his awesome design tokens list, which is a fantastic resource. That too links to all sorts of great articles. I guess, like any other naming in a design system, it's probably find something that works for your team. That's the important thing. You're trying to create, no, let me rephrase. One of the big benefits of design tokens is you can establish a shared vocabulary between your designers and your developers, both inside and outside of your design system team. So every design system is bespoke to the organization it's within. So I would say the naming convention should be as well, but you know, do what's right for your users. And by the way, that doesn't necessarily need to be English, right? If you're a company that is in another part of the world and maybe everyone is speaking some other language, why not name your tokens in that language? You can do that.
That's a great point. Thank you. I think that answered the question quite nicely. For the next one, do you advise to use tiers for core, semantic, or component tokens?
I assume you mean TypeScript? Or
sorry?
TS as in TypeScript, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so.
I mean, I guess, I suppose I'm obviously biased, you know, working on the standard. My preference would be once it's available, try and sort of express your tokens in that format and generate, for example, TypeScript code from it. Obviously, that's not really viable right now. So I know there are people who've used TypeScript for expressing their tokens. If that works for you, that's great. I do think the typing is useful. In fact, that's something we have in the format. So we have a very, it has in programming terms, I would say it's strongly typed. It has a notion of, you know, there are color tokens and spacing tokens and font tokens and things, and they're different and they expect their values to be in a particular format. And I think things like TypeScript can help with that. In fact, just remember there's a tool called Diez, D-I-E-Z, which is a kind of a token generating framework, and that's based on TypeScript as well. So that might be worth a look if that's what you're using.
Nice, thank you.
Sure.
Then for the next one, how are design tokens related to Tailwind utility classes?
So are they? Was that the question?
I think so, yes.
Yes and no, I would say. So from what I've seen with Tailwind, and admittedly it's been a little while since I've used it, but In some ways, yes. I think that some of the Tailwind utility classes, or more generally, sort of utility first CSS classes, are expressions of design tokens. So if you've got a class like, space large or something, and that is hopefully going to set the, use your large space token or whatever as its value, then there's a link. I think certainly out of the box with Tailwind, it's sort of it sort of lacks some of the semantics perhaps that some design system teams have. So you often get these different tiers of design tokens where you have, like, if you will, your base tokens that are kind of just names for actual values. And then you have a sort of mapping layer, which is where people apply more semantic names. So for example, your base token might be something like blue 500 is hex ABCDEF or whatever. And then you have a semantic token, which might be something like primary background color, and that is a mapping to the other to your blue 500 token. And I think Tailwind tends to be more of like the base token style, the classes. So it's kind of, you're accessing the raw, sort of the raw values, and less so the semantic stuff. And if that works for you, that's great. But I think a lot of design systems kind of tend to have the semantic layer because they find that useful. So I think you probably could muck about with the Tailwind config to do that, but like I said, I don't think out of the box it does it. So yeah, standard UX answer, right? It depends.
It always depends, but I think it's a great and very in-depth answer. Thank you.
Sure.
I wouldn't even know what Tailwind is, so that's already.
It's the Marmite of the CSS world, I would say. I don't know if that helps.
It's a short and sweet explanation. Thank you. Yeah, we have a few more. And this one I understand as well. Where are the first places in the design system where you would add design tokens?
Ooh. I guess you could start anywhere, but I think a lot of people start with colors because it's an easy one to understand, and also so today design tools like Figma and Sketch, out of the box, they don't really have a lot of token functionality. I'm hopeful that in the future they will do. I know they've all sort of expressed an interest in the standard format, so I think it's safe to assume that some future version of them will add more stuff. But what they do tend to, where they have something that's kind of vaguely equivalent to tokens, it tends to be colors, and typography is the other one, right? So Figma, for example, has got color styles and typography styles. And so if you don't want to or can't use plugins for some reason, and you have to rely on the native functionality, those are perhaps good places to start, because that's something you can kind of connect end to end from design tools through to code. Whereas that becomes more difficult when you start to go into things like spacing or borders or whatever, which don't necessarily work natively in design tools yet.
Yeah, I can just add to that. I would completely agree with you. And in the past, like, colors is always the easiest thing because it's the easiest thing for everybody. So there's also the most documentation and help around that if you look for some.
Yeah.
So
and there's a lot of really exciting stuff right now. I keep reading things about different color spaces and a lot of theory around not just using plain old RGB, but other ways to sort of create things that are more consistent luminance or more accessible in different ways. So I think there's a lot of exciting stuff happening in that space.
Thank you for that. One question we got as well is, how could we get involved in the W3C design token working group?
Excellent question. So we have a GitHub repository where that's where we have the code for our draft specification, which gets published to a URL. But there's a lot of GitHub issues there where there's a lot of debate going on right now. And anyone can come in and raise issues with suggestions for features or critiques of something that's in the draft. And we're really keen to get that feedback. apologies in advance if we might be a little slow to respond. I know how I have been because I've been busy preparing this talk, but now that it's over, I'm going to go back to GitHub in the coming days and get stuck in again. But we do generally read that stuff, and it's really, really valuable. So we'll see. If you suggest a feature, I can't promise that's going to be in the spec, or at least not in version 1 necessarily, but the more feedback we have, the better the standard will become for everyone. So yeah, definitely go there and check out the GitHub issues and add more if you have ideas.
Yeah, maybe you can share the link in the Marobot as well. I think a few people will be interested in that.
Yes, I see Kevin Powell has shared on, and if it is the Kevin Powell, I think it is. He's one of the fellow editors. So hi, Kev. Yes, it is. Cool.
Yeah, just shared in the Zoom Slack.
I'll add it to the mirror board as well. Yeah.
Chat. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Cool.
We have a lot of good questions. I think people were very much into your talk, so we still have some time. So I'm just gonna keep going.
Yeah, please.
Where are you in the standardization process, and are there any dates for that?
So we are, the process we're following, we have what's known as an editor's draft. So we had our initial editor's draft a few months ago. I think it was towards the end of last year. Now, in a sense, if you look at the spec today, it's kind of almost like a living document. So as we make changes to it, they kind of immediately get deployed. So we're sort of beyond the editor's draft a bit now. We are actually working towards a second editor's draft. So the idea is to kind of create almost like a snapshot of like, here's an update, which incorporates a number of changes since the last version. And then the next step will be what's known as I want to say final report. I hope that's the right term. And that's what we intend to do next. So after this kind of editor's draft, that's hopefully going to be pretty soon, there'll be another round of maybe tweaks and additions, and then we'll get towards this final report. And the idea with the final report is it's a signal to the community that the spec is kind of considered stable, and it's, sorry, there's rain outside, that it's safe for people to start using and implementing. It's not going to sort of change at a moment's notice. Now, don't get fooled by the name. Final report just means like final for version 1. We fully intend to sort of keep working at it over time. And I'm sure there's, things that might not make it into version 1 that might make it into future versions. So after that, there would be sort of another round of editor's draft and final drafts. So that's kind of how it's going to work. Sorry, it might be hail actually. The weather's been really weird here today. Oh, I'm in the UK. What can I say?
Yeah. No, I actually didn't notice. I was so enthralled by your answer. Very, very interesting, because normally you don't really like this W3C. Often it's like this big thing.
Yeah, I should perhaps stress. So we are what's known as a community group. So so W3C is, some of you probably know, is the organization that standardizes things like HTML and CSS, and they have their sort of official standards, and they have a very rigorous process they go through. But they also have this thing known as community groups, where people like us can basically do our own thing. And so we're not an official W3C standard, but they provide guidance and infrastructure for us. So they give us things like a blog and certain tools that help with creating the spec. But our spec is a community thing. So we're not a W3C standard, if that makes sense. That's not to say that maybe one day we couldn't be. I mean, I know they're keeping an eye on what we're doing and they're kind of interested in it, but for now, we're just kind of content being one of these community groups.
Good clarification. Thank you. Yeah, we have 2 more questions. When tokens change from name or value pairs into a complex information interchange format, where do you think the tipping point will be of complexity versus usability?
Good one. You know, when we started with the standard, we had a lot of debates around where we draw the line between tokens and components, because if you have enough tokens, you can kind of describe a UI component, or at least the visual aspects of it. So like, you know, should we, like, where's the sort of what's the scope of what we're trying to do versus, you know, I'm not sure we ever sort of really bottomed that out. But you're right, tokens are, at a minimum, they're a name and a value, but there's often other bits of sort of metadata you might want to associate with them. So for example, a description, which could appear in things like a style guide or in a code comment. And we're sort of, for the specification, we're debating other bits of metadata that might be useful. So for example, something to indicate whether or not a token has been deprecated and shouldn't really be used anymore, or things like, you know, who authored it, or what version was it introduced in, and so on. So yeah, they're kind of more than just names and values. They're almost like these little bundles of information. I guess, at least from the formats point of view, most of those things will be optional. So whether or not you use them is up to you. I guess I'd sort of put the question back to you, you know, like it's each team's decision to add as much information as is useful to them, but not so much that it's just kind of adding things for the sake of adding things and creating extra work or confusion. But where each team will draw the boundary, I imagine, will be different. And we try very hard not to be sort of prescriptive. So we're kind of standardizing, or trying to standardize what's important for things to be able to be interoperable, but not telling you how to name your tokens or organize them or how much information to put into them.
Okay, thank you. Then one very quick last question to kind of wrap it up. When is this tool / format going to be available? And I guess this refers to the last thing you showed, how to edit the tokens. Very quick.
We haven't got a fixed deadline. Most of us, I think, work on the format sort of as a side thing. So it is a little bit dependent on how much time people can sort of devote to it. I would hope within this calendar year we would get to the final draft, but my community group colleagues would probably kill me if I tried to sort of guess.
So maybe we could just say when it's ready.
Just keep an eye on the GitHub or our Twitter feed, and you know, obviously when we get to that point, we'll shout it from the rooftops, so you'll hear about it.
Nice. If there's any link or something you can share where people can follow you or follow the progress of that, I think people would really find it very valuable, or follow you.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was really great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Glad you liked it.
Yeah.
All right.
And